say hi back.
Oh, okay,
You guys
there
are
you
awesome on
go.
this cloudy Sunday. My name is Gail Brubaker, and I'm the Executive Director for the West Des Moines Historical Society, housed in this guy's house. James Jordan, one of the very early Anglo-European pioneers to this area, what became West Des Moines. Fascinating life, and we know so much more about him thanks to Louise Gately. She is the kind of person that we all love, a historian. She treasures stories, she records them. She made this permanent for posterity, and for that we cannot thank her enough. This has been a labor of love for her since she was a young child, so about 10 years ago. But what an amazing book, what an amazing end product to come out with for hours and hours of decades of research and talking to family members, Jordan family members, combing through dusty rooms, all have come up with this tone that is absolutely fascinating, well written, and will be a great gift for a history lover. Just saying, we're coming up on that time of year. The West Des Moines Historical Society will have copies of the book available for purchase. It is $30, and Louise has graciously offered to sign copies for you after the talk. So with no further ado, because this is the lady who you came to see, Louise Gately.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me okay? You hear me? Okay, good. I typically give a certain talk, and I gave one actually in this room to the Friends of the Library about, I don't know, several months ago. Maybe it was before summer even. And it was entertaining because a lot of times authors like to be a little bit more entertaining about, you know, the book they've written and, you know, get people engaged and whatever. And I hope I do somewhat entertain you, but I also hope that I educate you. And I did change my talk a little bit because it's Iowa Files, and that's a little bit more historically focused rather than, oh, you know, let me tell you a cute story about writing this book. But I do want to say this about it so that you kind of have a background about myself and why the book was written and what the book is all about. So when people do ask me about why did I write this book, they say, oh, you must be a Jordan. Are your ancestors Jordans? And I say, oh, absolutely not. I'm not a Jordan. And I, in fact, I was born and raised in Wisconsin. But I do have deep Iowa roots. I have relatives in Colfax that have had a farm since in the 1880s. My grandmother was born in 1900 in Boone. And I also attended college here in Des Moines at Drake University. And while I was at Drake, I studied history. But the interesting part of it, and this is always the little cute thing, is that even though I wrote a book about Iowa and Des Moines and pioneer family and all of this American history, my major focus studying history at Drake was the Renaissance and the Reformation, which has nothing to do really with this, except for it does have something to do with it, as you may learn in a little bit. And the reason why I really like that area of history is because I have always been interested in how religion affects history. And actually it did affect this book too, the history in this book, which you'll probably see a little bit of, but you'd probably want to read the book to understand it more. And it's definitely interwoven in the book, the way religion impacted the Jordan family and the state of Iowa and the country and everything. So that's kind of an interesting thing about the book, without being too religious, of course. So what I did is after I was at Drake, and I lived abroad in Germany for 4 years, but then I came back to Iowa, and I lived here on the west side of Des Moines, and then I ended up moving to West Des Moines, and I started to collect information about the Jordan family, which I'll explain about in a little bit. But what happened is that I started to collect so much stuff that my husband, after about 30 odd years of marriage, said to me, Louise, you have so much stuff that you've collected. Either write a book or do something with that information, that's, whatever, that will actually utilize it instead of just reading about all this stuff. and I was writing about what I learned. But at any rate, he said, do something with it or get rid of it. And so I was really under pressure to figure out what was I going to do. Well, I do want to say that I did eventually get rid of all the things that I had stored in my basement, and guess where they are right now? In my garage. And they're waiting, and they're awaiting their final resting place, which is someplace probably in West Des Moines, somewhere. I'm hoping, I have some ideas, but that will be determined probably in the next year or so. The reason why did I write the book? Well, I don't know if some of you probably remembers Baker's Cafeteria, not Bishop's Cafeteria. And some of you might remember that there was a very small Baker's Cafeteria near Drake, which is where I had a part-time job. I was the pie and coffee girl. And I got to know Russ and Vicki Baker really well. And of course, they grew up out here in West Des Moines. And after I graduated and lived abroad, then I came back and to Des Moines and hooked back up with Vicki and her husband Russ. So we became friends. Well, at that point in time, she had gotten involved as the president of the West Des Moines Historical Society, and that was in the late 70s, early 80s. She was not the first one, but it was right after the West Des Moines, not long after the West Des Moines Historical Society had been founded, around the purpose pretty much of, number one, the 75th anniversary of West Des Moines, and also the situation, which was really a challenging situation about what to do with the Jordan house. It had been a dilapidated former dormitory for campers for the Church of the Nazarene. That was the old Church of the Nazarene campgrounds, and it was in such terrible condition that the city was wanting to burn it down or do something. And that's when the citizens got together, and they actually, Bonnie McFadden at the time, she passed long time ago, but she rallied the troops. They saved the building, bought it I think for $20,000, and then the long renovation process started in the late 70s, early 80s, and Vicki was at that point president and very interested in getting this house put back together. And what an effort it was, because it was in horrendous shape. So at that point, I became friends with Vicki, and I eventually got onto the West Des Moines Historical Society board in the early to mid 80s. I had by then moved to West Des Moines, and at that point too I was getting my master's degree in higher ed administration with an emphasis in development, which is fundraising. And one of the things I learned how to do is write grants, and that was one of the ways that they were going to, of course, get money to renovate, was to write a lot of grants. And so I learned how to do that, and then applied those skills to grant writing for helping Vicki and doing grant writing for the West Des Moines Historical. And most of the grants that we wrote focused on what was really popular at the time, and that was Black history, the Underground Railroad, and that sort of thing. This was more into the mid 80s. And there was money available. So we would write away for that, and also write away money from, just locally, we would get money from the city of West Des Moines, Polk County, and so forth. So this was all a very nice, moment for all of us, and we felt very supported. And the renovation began and continued and so forth. When I did write the grants, and when Vicki and I wrote the grants, we of course needed to explain, what about James Jordan? Why is he a big deal? Why is that house there? Why is it so important? Is it important? And of course, we knew it was important because it was a stop on the Underground Railroad, and that's kind of where the knowledge stopped. So knowing that it had been a dormitory in a camp, you knew that there was nothing left in the attic. If there was, it was just shreds of papers or whatever, and the mice and the other varmints had gotten to that. So there was no way that you could be like Nancy Drew and discover like the secret chest, with all this stuff. And some of the family members had some things, and then we did get some other information from family members. And I just want to remind you that this was in the early to mid 80s and then going into the 90s. And did we have internet then? Did we have any kind of Google? Did we have Safari? No, we did not. So the information that I started to assemble and collect all came from books, newspaper clippings, some files, the family, and whatever. And That's why I have so many things in my garage right now, because I had to collect all this information and go over it that way. Since the internet has been a wonderful introduction to all of our lives, I think, especially when you're writing a history, it's so much easier. Everything is at your fingertips and you don't have to do so much hard work to find information. So that was a blessing for me later on. So as things progressed, I was on the board. I started to write about the Underground Railroad, write the grants, starting to write about the Jordan history, collecting stories. And what I would do is when people wanted to know more and more, and people understood now that there was some information about James Jordan, they'd say, what about it? What about the Underground Railroad? What about Jordan House? And I'd say, oh, well, this is something I wrote. Or what about West Des Moines history? Or even, what about Des Moines history? This is what I wrote. This is what I found out. And here it is. And I just give it to them. I just gave it away. And I considered it a community service. And I just kept doing this and doing this and doing this. And then we had we made a DVD about the history and, the best job we could do with the research that I had done. And so that was on playing at the Jordan House for probably 20 or maybe more years, which I loved it because I did it when I was really young. And every time I looked at it, I thought, oh, I looked pretty good back then, much thinner. So at any rate, then what happened is that I started to, as word started getting out, it's kind of like the game of telephone. And what happens is you hear a story and then it gets a little twisted. Or maybe you hear some history and it's not proper history. And I was getting mad because it was like, oh, well, they think that they're experts on James Jordan. Well, what do they know, Well, you know what? They didn't really know, because guess what? All they had was this little piece of this or this little piece of that. And I thought, you know what? That's my problem, because I need to get the word out better. How do I do that? But I, at that time, have a big family and we had a full life, and I thought, I don't know. I'm not making any commitments to anything more than what I'm doing. I just couldn't. Well, then a publishing house came through, the Jordan House, Donning Publishing. It's out of Omaha, and then they have their printing presses in northern Missouri. And the representative came through. His name was Barry Hare, and he said, what about the story about the Jordan House? I work with a bunch of people all over the upper Midwest, and I'm working on all these books that people are writing, and that's what our company does. And we would love to have that story if anybody would be interested in, putting it together or whatever. And Penny at the Jordan House said, you need to call Louise, because she's the one that has all the stuff. And he did, and for 6 years he hounded me. 6. And I said, I'm not writing a book. I don't have time to write a book. Well, what happened was my husband gave the mandate, and at that point, yeah, I thought, do I want to save my marriage or not? But anyways, so what happened was, and the West Des Moines Historical Society was changing. Since the 80s, the early 80s, they had focused on renovation, which they needed to do. It was a wreck of a house, a place, but it was getting better. And they also, their main focus was the Underground Railroad, because that's where the funding would come from, for the most part, if it was outside the city. But then, people realized, well, what about the man who built this place? And what was so special about him? Well, the word that was getting out, some of the things that I had written and were passing around, like, for example, he brought the capital to Des Moines. He was responsible for the capital of Des Moines moving from Iowa City to Des Moines. He did that. Now, that's significant. But did we ever hear about that? No. We just heard about him being the chief conductor of the Underground Railroad in Polk County, which is significant. But being responsible for that legislation made a huge difference in central Iowa, and it was his town. He considered Fort Des Moines his home, and he wanted it here, and he was able to persuade the legislators to vote that in. So those were the kind of things that, oh my gosh, well, maybe James Jordan is a little bit more notable, in many ways than just the Underground Railroad or some other things. So what happened was I realized that maybe it was time to write a book, and that was about 4 or 5 years ago. I did not know how to write a book, and I found the perfect accomplice to be my editor. And she's sitting right here. Her name is Jan Davison. And she also was at Drake when I was at Drake. We're about age mates. And that was so cool. I did not know her. I did not know her, but boy, have we become close friends. And what a blessing in my life. So she's here, and I might even have her talk. I know I only have so long to talk, so we'll see how long this takes. So so I did not know how to write a book, so I got an editor, and then I did not know how to publish a book other than Barry here saying that he would, have his company publish it. But I thought, I need to know more about this, or at least put a team together. I'm a real team player. So what happened was I assembled a team, and Jan was on it, and Barry here, the Downing Publishing representative, was on it, and Michael Swanger, who's the publisher editor of the Iowa History Journal. And you can see this is from the time that the book was published, but this is a copy of the Iowa History Journal. It comes out, I think, every other month. He agreed to be on my team, our team. And Jim Miller, the executive director of the Historic Valley Junction Foundation, he also was very happy to be on it, and he helped get the book published through the city. And Scott Little, who was retired at this time, he was a 30-year veteran of Meredith Publishing in photography. He's a beautiful photographer. He put hundreds of hours in pro bono to make these pictures in the book fabulous. It's professional. And then another gal, Katie Getting, who had worked for the West Des Moines Historical Society and now was working at that point at Living History Farms. She'd left the West Des Moines Historical, but knew a lot about it. And she was our millennial. You always need a millennial on your team because they know how to do the computer. And they know how to do all this stuff that I don't know how to do. And she was really, really important too. And she's also very bossy, so she told me, do this, do that, and that's good. I didn't have to think. Because, don't young people know it all? And believe me, she did. She really does. She's really smart. She also was a former Drake. She was graduated from Drake, summa cum laude, in guess what? History. So really, really lucky to have her on the team. So what happened was, because the Valley Junction Foundation took such a leadership role in trying to get this book published and out, Jim Miller had the brilliant idea of linking it with West Des Moines' 125th anniversary. So they took responsibility for working with the city, and I donated everything to them. So we actually, it was a contract my husband drew up to donate this to Valley Junction Foundation, and then they took it, and they own it. So the book, when you buy a book, you're giving it back to your community. You're not giving me any money, so that's good. And also, the West Des Moines Historical Society was extremely supportive too in helping this venture take place and be successful. So this book is a local effort. There's no big box stores. You're not going to see it in Barnes & Noble at this point in time. If we do a reprint, probably. But right now, we wanted it to be a local thing. And so we sell this book through the Valley Junction Foundation office, through the West Des Moines Historical Society, and also Beaverdale Books, another local, bookstore. And if by the time, and we printed 1,000 copies, which many were getting closer to our goal of selling all 1,000, and if all 1,000 copies are sold, if you do your math, we'll have generated $30,000 that'll come back into our local community, which we're very proud of. There was no money that anybody charged to put this book together, none of my team, nobody. It's all donated. So we have everybody on the team to thank. The book itself is 45 chapters long, little chapters, and a lot of people, when they read the book, they'll skip around to parts that they're interested. Some people are not interested in the beginning history that starts out in the eastern part of the United States. But some people are, it just depends, or some people will go back to it. Some people start with railroads because they're interested in railroads. Some people start with the Civil War. Some of the women like to read the chapters about women and what it was like to be a pioneer housewife, or women in the Victorian time, or just women, period, that you see around. The book also has a big section on the local Native Americans who resided in Iowa. There's like 7 pages, which is very unheard of in literature from, talking about white pioneer settlement, or, the story of the settlement of a place. that is normally written by people that are non-Indian. So that's very unusual too, and it's a very comprehensive section as well. So it's divided, the book is 45 chapters, it's divided into 6 different sections of the times of his life. And it was interesting because lots of it was written before we even realized that we were going to divide it and subdivide it and whatever. It just came naturally. The divisions came after it was written. They were a natural outcome of the writing, including the sections and the subheadings. We didn't even know we were going to do it until it was happening. And Jan was so instrumental in helping format all of that as an editor. And I want to say she had never really been an editor. So we were both kind of the blind leading the blind. And it was really a very amazing journey for the two of us. So the book itself is a biography, but it's also a historical narrative of a pioneer family. And I just talked to a gal here that's sitting in the corner, and she said, this could be my family. And actually, I have read other pieces or books that talk about pioneer families, and there's one, and I cannot remember the name of the title. The Reckoning. And it's written by a Canadian author who had family down here, and they did almost the exact same journey. I read it after my book was published, or our book was published, and it was like, did they read my book? Because it was like it was almost exactly parallel. It was a wonderful validation of the research and the writing that we had done. And so I was very proud and happy to see that, and then also see this and talk to this woman. And truly, what happened, if you have any ancestors that came to Des Moines area, or even Iowa during the certain dates that we talk about in the book, that probably is the story of your family as well. Not exactly the same names, but you can almost, you can place it. You can place your family, and it's your story. Particularly if you're Scots-Irish descent. Some people think that they're Irish, but they probably originated in Scotland and then went to the Ulster Plantation in northern Northern Ireland, or Germany, and typically the Palatinate area. But, that's a whole nother story. This book talks about the settling of the United States. It talks about the settling of the state of Iowa, the greater Des Moines area, and also about the beginnings of West Des Moines. And it explains Jordan's motivation of why he did what he did. Why did he do this? That was always my question. He did all this stuff, but why? And what was so important about starting, say, the State Bank of Iowa? What was so important about starting some Methodist churches, or what was so important about getting the railroad? That's obvious to us now, but I mean, you really understand that when you do the research, and he definitely was very interested in that. Or the politics of the time. Why did he even want to be elected? What was that all about? So why he did, he was very religious, he was very political, and he was also very community minded, and also very, very attached to his Methodist roots and religion. So what I want to do is I want to start with the whole saga. And the Jordan Cunningham saga actually starts in Scotland and Germany, and before the Revolutionary War in the 1740s and 50s. And the Cunninghams were originally from Scotland, and you can see on the book that this is a plaid, and this is the Cunningham plaid. And it's from they came originally in Scotland from the Ayrshire area of Scotland, which is near Glasgow, a little bit to the southwest of Glasgow. Cattle country, cows. And then that family ended up, because of political issues and whatever, removing themselves out of that part of Scotland and moving into the Ulster Plantation, which is that Belfast, Northern Ireland area. So that's why you think that they're Irish, but they're really Scots-Irish, and that's really an unimportant thing to know. They were Presbyterians, they were, and they lived there for about 100 more years. So they left in the 1600s, and then they eventually came over to, the Cunninghams came over to America and it wasn't even the United States then, in the 1740s and 50s, okay? And then the other side of the family, the Jordans, they were German. And originally I had so much trouble figuring this out because the family history said that the Jordans were Dutch. They were not Dutch. They were Deutsch. And I realized that, but it took me a long time to figure out, how come I don't see any Jordans in Holland, and this by the time we're on the internet. What's the deal here? This is driving me crazy. Well, no, then we could then trace some Jordans that came into the United States back to where they came from in Germany, and they came from the Palatinate area, which is the area along the Rhine River. And they came, and it was after the 30 Years' War, and this is where my Renaissance and Reformation, my Reformation history came in, because the 30 Years' War coincided with the time of the Reformation. And it was also a time where Germany was in huge upheaval, and the economy was in terrible condition, and everybody was starving, and they were trying to get out of Germany as much as they could. So James's ancestors, one of the brothers, there were two brothers, George and John. There's so many George, Johns, and James that there's no way, for a long time we were like, oh my gosh, which one is this? Poor Jan and I. But at any rate, the older brother came to the America first, to New York, settled there, and then the younger brother, which is James's direct descent or ancestor, he came later, probably thinking he was going to join his brother. Now remember, they speak German, they don't speak English, they don't know what they're doing. And he ended up landing not in New York, but in Philadelphia. And he had no money, and the way he paid his fare was to say, I will work for somebody for 7 years, and then the person who he's going to work for has met the ship in Philadelphia and said, yeah, I'll take that guy, he looks strong. Okay, come here, here's his fare. And then the guy goes with him to wherever, and then they work. It's an indentured servant. But these people were called redemptionists, because what they were doing is they were redeeming their fare. So the ones from Germany were called redemptionists. So you know what happened to the Jordan side of the family, indentured servitude. The Cunningham side of the family, however, they also came into Philadelphia from probably capital of Ireland, Dublin. They got themselves down to Dublin and then came over on a ship again to Philadelphia. It took a couple years to get through Pennsylvania, and at the time, Western Virginia was not settled. People didn't even know about it. What was going on over these big mountain ranges that separate the Tidewater and lowland area of in the sort of the foothills of the Appalachians. That was all where the plantations were. Then there was this like wall of mountains, and then to the west were all these jagged but beautiful river valleys, mountains, whatever. It's a big geology story, which we're not going to go into. But it's gorgeous, but really, really hard to transport yourself, full of the native peoples that were friendly in the beginning, but still, nobody wanted to go over the mountain. It's kind of like the bear went over the mountain to see what he could see. They didn't want to see anything. But then there was a governor who said, you know what? We have to figure out what we're going to do, because this is part of our land that we had gotten, Virginia. And at that time, Virginia actually extended all the way to the Mississippi River. So he said, it's time for us to figure this out. But all the people that were comfortable in the eastern part of Virginia had no intention of leaving their comfy homes and farms and whatever. And so what they did was they said, oh, well, let's do this. Let's open that up to all these Scots, Irish, and German immigrants that are coming in. They can go settle it, and they can handle all that, and they can fight off the Indians and whatever, and we'll just stay comfortable here and let them do what they're going to do over there. And that's really what it was. They were like even though we now have Virginia and West Virginia, at the time it was one big place, and but it was still really two places because of the geography of the situation. And how did those immigrants, those German and Scots-Irish immigrants, come into Western Virginia? They came in through Pennsylvania. They came in through the north. So they make their way from Philadelphia across, and then they drop down into Western Virginia, around Wheeling and maybe points further west. And they get into these river valleys that were going north and south, and then they would settle them. So the Cunninghams had heard that there was some pretty good land in the bottomlands in that area, and that was the good land because it was by the rivers, and that had good soil. And so they settled in a place that we now know as Cunningham, West Virginia. There's a town, there's an area. It's not really a town, but it is an area. And if you Google it, you'll see it. And they settled there, so it's still there. And they settled and they ended up starting a plantation. Of course, you know, there was slavery in Virginia, so it was perfectly legal to purchase slaves. And once they got themselves put together and barns built and houses built and so forth and so on, then it turned into a really very, very successful plantation. And so that part of the family was slave owning. The Jordan side, however, poor. And once his ancestor was released from his indenture, he was only able to buy land up in the highlands. Poorer land, not so good, raising some cattle, a few. Down in the valley, the Cunninghams raising lots of cattle, very successful, whatever. Now, what happened was, there's a big story in the book about what happened where, just a minute, I gotta get to my next page because it's kind of complicated, but it's kind of interesting too. Okay, so James's grandfather was killed. Okay, so at this point in time, the Indians were friendly, and then they got upset because all of these people are coming in and taking their land. In fact, where the Cunningham plantation was an Indian old field, and it was shared by another family, the Van Meters, which is really weird because we have the Jordan house, and right down the street is Van Meter, Iowa. I have not figured out that connection. I don't know if there even is one, but it's bizarre. And they all intermarried with each other too in Virginia. So who knows? But at any rate, they took over an Indian old field, which was where the Indians would have their celebrations and the tribes would share it. So one tribe would come through, they have their celebrations. It was cleared area, so wildlife came through, they could shoot it and eat it. It was near water, and that's how it was. And it's very similar, and I want to plant a seed in your head, but you know, this is me. The land that's right next to the Jordan house, that open area right next to Jordan Creek, that to me seems like an Indian old field, only on a much smaller scale. At any rate, but you can kind of pick them out, you know, where there's not too many trees, and it's been kept clear for that reason, so that they can camp easily and so forth. Well, that's where the pioneers wanted to settle because they didn't have to cut down trees. It was all open land, they could farm it easily. And the Indians, and they kept taking over all these Indian old fields all over the area, plus they were taking over their own, you know, hunting grounds. And so the Indians started to get upset. And so one story is that just a second, here we go. James's grandfather was killed by the Indians, and his pregnant grandmother and their 9-year-old son, James, who became James Jordan's father, were taken captive by the Indians. James's grandmother and her baby daughter were released from captivity a year later. But James's father was held captive for 6 years. He became blind during that time, or partially blind. He then eventually returned from this situation with a wife, and this man was never the same. And he left plantation life to go further west and up in the hills. I'm sure he was terribly affected by this. And that was James's father. So James Jordan's father. So think about that. So they're all out in further western Virginia, kind of in their own area. The Jordans are out there too, up in the hills. So let's talk about how they lived in western Virginia, and then we'll continue to get over to Iowa here soon. Then his grandfather, James Jordan's grandfather, fought in the Revolutionary War. And afterwards, he and his wife, they went to southeastern Illinois. There was a big settlement there. It was considered part of Virginia, and they wanted, again, to keep staking out land further. So they settled there for several years. But then the wife died, and then they went, the husband and the son came back east. The father, the husband, ended up settling and remarrying in Kentucky, and kind of abandoned his son, who was by then a teenager. The son went back to some old Jordan land in western Virginia, and that's when the Cunninghams blend in. He met James Jordan's mother in that kind of wild West Virginia area. They got married, and then they had 11 children. So they lived in Western Virginia, this family. They raised their 11 children, and then the father died. And so there's just the mom, and her name was Agnes, and she ended up thinking, oh my gosh, what am I going to do now? I've got all these kids. They were teenagers. I don't know what we're going to do. Well, one of them was a minister. One of her children was a minister and married to a woman whose brother was a minister. And he said, you know, there's this area in southwestern Michigan that is just opening up from the Indians. Why don't we go there, establish a church, buy some land, get out of Virginia? Why would they want to get out of Virginia? Well, because in the time since they were Presbyterians, they'd become Methodists. And the Methodist Church at that point was starting to split over the issue of slavery, the Northern Methodists and the Southern Methodists. And the Jordans were definitely Northern Methodists, and they were very indoctrinated against slavery through their religion. Also, the slaves in the state of West Virginia was 80 slaves to 100 people. So if you had 100 people, you had 20 white people and 80 slaves, which was a scary thing, particularly in the East. Very scary. Also, in 1776 and 77, that's during the American Revolution, the white people in Western Virginia were very upset with the white people in Eastern Virginia because they kept on not giving them services. The government was not helping the people in West Virginia. The East Virginia government was not helping them, and so they were more and more discontent and continued to become discontent. And then in 1831, now that's 25 years or so before the Civil War, we have Nat Turner's Rebellion. This is in 1831. And that's when 56 slaves slaughtered 56 white people in Eastern Virginia, which really scared them. So with the advent of James's mom becoming a widow, all of this stuff going on, that was bad enough. But also they were living in the part of Western Virginia where escaping slaves, and I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Harriet, but not unlike that, they were escaping from this area in droves through these mountainous areas where they could have cover, getting themselves up to Ohio, and then the people in Ohio would get them across across Lake Erie to Canada. And so they saw these slaves constantly, on the run, and so that unnerved them as well. And so they became abolitionists, and they decided this is ridiculous. I think that Nat Turner's Rebellion was the final blow, and they said we're out of here. And also the dad died. They had owned several not terrible farms, not plantations or anything, in the area. They sold them. 3, I think, of the daughters who were married stayed in Western Virginia, and the rest of them got into the wagon, a wagon train, and they headed to southwestern Michigan. In southwestern Michigan, they settled, they homesteaded there, and they stayed there for 5 or 6 years. And at that time, this is in the 1830s and past into the later 1830s, the family had heard of these Methodist missionaries who had really broken the ground of the Oregon Trail. And they came back talking about how beautiful it was in the land of milk and honey in the Willamette Valley of Oregon and also the northeastern part of the United States, northwestern part of the United States, and they caught that fire. They were very, very fervent Methodists. During that time also, James Jordan and his brother married 2 sisters, the Pittman sisters, Melinda and Drusilla. And a lot of those kids who were teenagers grew up, and they also got married. And they were looking for another adventure. And they thought, oh, well, this sounds pretty exciting, and maybe we need to go out there. This is such a beautiful area, according to what we've heard. And so what they did is they sent kind of an investigative party to go to St. Joseph and Independence, Missouri area to just check out, because that's where all, of course, the wagon trains were leaving from to go west. But there weren't so many at the time, but more and more started to go. So they did a few of them went. They said, this is the real deal. You know, we can do this. And so one by one, the family members, and there were probably 4 or 5 of the brothers and sisters, spouses, whatever, they slowly sold their farms and made huge profits, by the way. They flipped their farms. And they made a lot of money, and they took that money and their, goods, and they went from western Michigan, Berrien County, Michigan, to resettle outside of what we now know as Kansas City, which at that time was called Westport. And they did that, and they also homesteaded there. But on the way there, just like a day or so before they actually got to one of the siblings who had actually was one of the front guard and had actually settled there and said, come on, it's time. They just gotten to this one, almost to the sister's farm, and they met this guy named Calvin Smith. And Calvin Smith was a young guy, and he had, and he was single, and he was good looking, and he fell in love with James Jordan's little sister Agnes, who was maybe 18 years old. He was a little older. And he just said, when I saw her, I knew I wanted to marry her. Well, they did get married, and what was amazing about that is his father was one of the very first settlers to that part of Missouri. He was a huge abolitionist. He started the town of Smithville, Missouri, which is near the Kansas City airport, if you've ever been down in that area. Still called that. And and James and Calvin Smith became really, really close friends and also business partners. And what they did is they had a large livestock business that they started, and it was very profitable. The whole idea being that what they would do is they would raise these livestock, sell them to wagon trains going west, make lots of money, and then they cherry pick the best livestock for themselves for their own wagons when they were going to go west. Well, we're approaching the late 1830s now, and at that point in time, there was word out that, oh, geez, the Iowa Territory might be opening up because there's a lot of problems in Iowa, and the natives are, in debt, and there's a lot of problems and whatever, and so forth and so on, and the Black Hawk War had, been, and lots and lots and lots going on. So what was going to happen? Are they going to go to the Northwest, or maybe they should think about Iowa? It's not open yet, but it might be, and the timeline was just about right. So what happened was James Jordan and his brother John, remember they'd married sisters, the two guys went up the Dragoon Trail. Have you heard of that? Have you seen the signs? There were trails all over the area, and they were Dragoon trails. They went from one fort to another, to another, to another, to another. There was a Dragoon trail that went from Fort Leavenworth, which is near Kansas City, up to, guess what, Fort Des Moines. And there were trails that led out from Fort Des Moines to different forts all over the state of Iowa. But this one is the one that we're going to talk about. So they made their way up that Dragoon Trail, which had originally been an Indian trail. Probably first an animal trail, then an Indian trail, and then the Dragoons, and then it was the Dragoon Trail. They went up it, and they got to Fort Des Moines, and it was totally illegal for them to be there because at that point, that part of Iowa was not part of the United States. There was a small area, and you can see it on that map. See this one here? This was part of the United States, right here. This is southeastern Iowa. And here is Iowa City, and all the rest of it is, the rest of our rectangle of Iowa is Indian land. Soon to be not Indian land because they had, the Indians had really gone into debt, they had a lot of problems, whatever, and so their land was being negotiated right out from under their feet. And that's in the book too. And so what happened was the boys, the two Jordan boys, go up to Fort Des Moines, even though they're not supposed to be there, and they're not alone. There's a lot of people who are going up into Iowa, sneaking up into Iowa, trying to start a farm in Iowa, completely illegal, getting pushed back out by the Dragoons or the U.S. military, saying you're not supposed to be here. You cannot be here. Go back into the United States. This is not your area. And anyways, they were affable people, affable guys, and they made friends with the guys at the fort, and the guys at the fort, they knew what the news were. They'd already staked out their land in Iowa, in Des Moines area, and they said, hey, what do you want to do if you decide you want to settle here? We want to do a cattle operation. You need water. Okay, great. So, how about going down west by the Raccoon River over in this area, because there's a lot of water, there's a lot of good bottom land, you can graze your cattle, they can get water, cattle need water, and so on. So they went, they blazed trees, they marked the trees, and this is a year or two before the Iowa Territory was even opened up. The Indians left in 1845. There was finally enough population in Iowa by 1846 for it to become a state, but this is before that. So that was all prearranged by all the good old boys that were there at the time. And so that's kind of an interesting thing. They were called squatters when they first got there. A little bit about Fort Des Moines. It was built in the 1830s. The soldiers all got there by steamboat coming up the Des Moines River. When the Indians, the Native Americans, did have to vacate, the United States government paid them 10 cents an acre for the land. And then when they did when they did need to leave, which was in the October of 1845, the dragoons escorted them back down that dragoon trail, back out of the country, because by now Iowa is part of the United States, to the other side of the Missouri River, a little bit southwest of Fort Leavenworth, and that's where they were put onto a reservation and given a stipend, an annual stipend of money to survive. And then they were expected to farm or hunt or whatever. And, again, read the book and you'll find out what happened, because it's kind of an interesting story. So then what happens? It's time to settle in Iowa, and they do. And a really interesting story is some of those Indians didn't leave when they were supposed to. And the very first winter was a horrible winter. There was like 10 feet of snow in like 24 hours or something. It was a terrible, terrible winter. And guess who helped the Jordan family survive that and survive the winter? Some of the Indians that didn't leave. That always sat really heavily in James's heart. And later on, when he was a legislator in the Iowa legislature, he helped those tribes to repurchase some of the land that they had lost. And so that's why we have Tama, and we do not have a reservation here. They own their land. And a lot of it has to do with James Jordan and his colleagues. So let's talk about Jordan now here in Des Moines and in West Des Moines. So he settled in, and in his early political life, of course, I'm going to tell you that Fort Des Moines the name of it wasn't even changed until the late 1850s. And that was, and then they changed it to Des Moines. And that was because they finally figured out that the capital was going to come here, and they needed to do that. And that was all decided in the mid 1850s through the efforts of James Jordan. James, in order to even go to the Senate, he had to start in politics somewhere. And he was actually on the city council, the town council of Fort Des Moines back in the early 1850s. He, a West Des Moines or Valley Junction or Walnut Township or whatever guy, considered himself part of that town, because that was the only town. He just had a little house out here by the Raccoon River. So he and Thompson Bird was the mayor at the time. Thompson Bird was the Presbyterian minister, started the first Presbyterian church here. His wife Anna has started the first school here. Anna Bird School, if you're a longtime Des Moines resident, it was over kind of where Gateway Market is, now torn down, kind of near where Woodland Cemetery is. And Birdland Park was named for Thompson Bird. And Thompson Bird, he was a very, very smart businessman, bought a lot of land, and he probably donated a lot of that back to the city, which is probably part of the park. I just think that's kind of an interesting little side story. Anyways, that launched James Jordan, that city council spot, or town council spot, launched him into state politics. And then he was elected in 1854 to the state legislature, and he ended up doing all the things that he did. One of the things he was most proud of is passing prohibition laws, which here in Iowa stuck until the late 1800s. And he was so proud of that because, again, Methodist, and he was not a fan of people imbibing. So I just want to briefly go over, and these are things that you will read in the book too, that he was a local activist in his area, which was called Walnut Township. He was a school superintendent, started the first school. He also started several churches in the area. When he was born in 1813, it was exactly the same time that Abraham Lincoln was born. We know that that was the beginning, that Abraham Lincoln was very much, and his friends were very much involved in starting the Republican Party, as were James Jordan's friends, Samuel Kirkwood, James Harlan, James Grimes. All of them, they were all friends. They were all really good friends. They were all abolitionists. They all helped to start the Republican Party, which really did start more in the Coralville area, even though we attribute it to Ripon, Wisconsin. The first meeting really was in Coralville. Sorry, Republicans, but it was here in Iowa. And who knows, maybe James Jordan knew Abraham Lincoln. Nothing proven. Also during that time, there was, James Jordan was very much involved with his first wife, Melinda, and then later on, for sure with Cynthia, his second wife, in the Underground Railroad. And he was very instrumental in helping slaves. Now, I thought it was interesting when I saw the Harriet Tubman movie that they are for sure about 70 slaves that she helped. When we read the story about Harriet Tubman helping slaves, we think it's hundreds and hundreds. Well, in the movie, and they're not going to tell a lie. I mean, then later on she helped hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, but that was, not during the pre-Civil War days. So we say that we don't know how many slaves Jordan helped, through that Underground Railroad network, which came out of Missouri, went over to Nebraska City, Nebraska, and then started through the southern area of Iowa. But bottom line is that, we can pretty much document between around 30, maybe more, we don't know. And a lot of people think that it might be 50, who knows? It was a secret, and nobody knows. And none of his children talked about their involvement in the Underground Railroad, and they were all living in the Jordan house at the time until 1875. That's the first time you read about any of the children even mentioning that they participated in the Underground Railroad. So that's, I think, very interesting. So that's an important part of his life, and his wives were fully involved. And his second wife, Cynthia, actually came from the part of upstate New York where the slaves were transported. Her town was right on that Canadian border, so she probably had been active or knew about activity before she came to Iowa. He was very instrumental in helping, he and his buddies helping start the Republican Party. Many of the meetings, by then the capital was in Des Moines, and many of the meetings took place at the Jordan house, probably in the front parlor, so if you walk in there, you might hear little echoes of some of those famous Iowans. Then also, he was friends with John Brown, who was a huge abolitionist, and John Brown personally escorted many of the slaves to the Jordan house through the network in southern Iowa. He was also a huge agribusiness man, and I told you that he always knew that he was going to start a cattle operation, and that was really a DNA kind of engineered deal, because he was very much into the cattle all of his life from the time he was a little boy on. And he had a very successful cattle and hog operation. At one time, and remember, we did not have railroads back then, when he started it, 2,000 head of cattle. How do you get the cattle out of the prairie land that they were grazing on to market, which at that point was St. Louis, down the rivers on flatboats, and that's how they did it. They did it that way for years. So you can imagine how excited he, and so was Abraham Lincoln. I mean, that was the time. To get the railroads out here, oh my goodness. And prior to the Civil War, they finally got the bridge across the Mississippi River down by Rock Island, but then They only could get it built to Eddyville, 65 miles away, and it stopped at the Civil War. So after the Civil War, then the heat was on, and I usually have Jan talk about that. But that is a fun story in this book about the race of the railroads, because everybody wanted the railroad to come to their town. But James Jordan and 70 businessmen each contributed, and he was a ringleader in it, bribe money really to the railroads to come to Des Moines. And they generated between $70,000 and $100,000 to bribe them. So that's important. Also, from that evolved James Jordan wanting, it's good enough that it's in Des Moines, now he can put his cattle on railroad cars, and they would go to, not anymore to St. Louis, to Chicago. But wouldn't it be better if he could have those cattle loaded close to his home so he could bring them in from the west? This is before barbed wire fences. And then he could put them in cattle pens by 8th Street, down in that bottomlands by railroad, and then load them onto cars. So he bribed the railroad to bring tracks out to close to his house so it was convenient for him. And the railroad said to him, you know, we'll do this, but you need to build a few little houses for our workers so we can keep the tracks repaired and all that. And that's the beginning of Valley Junction in the early 1870s, okay? And then from there, and that was over by 8th Street, but then what happened is the railroad got bigger and bigger and bigger, and then 5th Street, he owned all the land in that area. He sold it to developers, and then they started 5th Street as the main street, and the bars and the saloons, and you know what else goes with that. That was, I mean, we were a bad town for a long time, had a terrible reputation. And here's Methodist James saying, oh my gosh, the drinking, I started this town, these women, you know, what's going on? And it was so bad that the policemen, in order to just finance the police department, they'd go around to all the different bars and collect a monthly amount of money from them, because they knew, you know, they had to support themselves and have money to put these people in jail and whatever, and the jails were full, the jail was full. So that's how bad it was. Anyway, so in the meantime, during this time, James Jordan is building his last and final church, and that is where Merrill Middle School is. And they had started in a schoolhouse down where Clegg Park School was, and now I don't know what it's called, but anyways, they started a church there, and they outgrew it. They didn't want to be in a school building, so they decided they would build a big, wonderful, beautiful Methodist church. Well, they ran out of money, but the church board was smart enough to put a Jordan son on the board. And so when they totally ran out of money, they appealed, you know, to the son to talk to Dad, and Dad said, yes, I'll help out. And so what happened was he did help out. And he financed the final building, you know, construction of the church, which was gorgeous. And okay, so here's the deal. Here he's seeing Valley Junction going down the tubes because it's this terrible, terrible railroad town. And here's this lovely church that's in his name. And at that point in time, this is in the late, it's like in 1891 or in the 1890s, he's really failing in health. His heart is bad, things are, you know, terrible with his health, and he's probably getting ready to die. But he wanted to be sure that he got to this church because it really was meaningful to him, being the big Methodist that he was, the devout Methodist that he was. And I'm going to just read this to you because this is, and I will be done. And if you want to go, you can. I'm a little bit over my time. But I'm going to tell you, this is what we say in the book. The dedication date was set for Sunday, March 1st, 1891, 3 days before his birthday. When the big day arrived, James had to be coaxed to attend. He was not feeling well. However, once he and Cynthia were settled in the front pew, Uncle Jimmy became immersed in the rhetoric of Dr. Newman, Dr. Reese, and Pastor Lausch, who were in charge of the dedication services. Dr. Newman declared, "The people are here to dedicate a house of God, not a theater or a concert hall, nor an amusement or dance hall," which, of course, were all down in Valley Junction. Whereupon James, with an overflowing heart, suddenly jumped up. Now remember, he's really sick. Jumped up and cried, "Nor a saloon!" And almost before the congregation could respond with an amen, James' head fell forward, and before anyone could reach him, he collapsed and dropped over dead. Paralysis of the heart was announced as the cause of his death. He was 3 days short of his 78th birthday and died exactly 36 years after his first wife, Melinda. His son-in-law, George Hannawalt, a doctor. Have you ever heard of Hannawalt, that word? His daughter, Emily, married George Hannawalt. George Hannawalt started all the hospitals in Des Moines, which is in this book. I can't tell you everything. Anyway, George Hannawalt, who was an Episcopalian and was not at this Methodist service, was called to the scene, and according to local accounts, he said, "It was the hardest task in all my life to go back and tell my wife Emily the news." So, anyways, I want to just read one more little part, okay? At his funeral, held at Jordan Methodist Church at 2 p.m. on Wednesday, March 4th, the day after his birthday, or excuse me, the date of his 78th birthday, James Jordan was eulogized as follows. He had lived through a most momentous period in American history, and on more than one occasion, his influence was directly beneficial along the lines of public improvement. The cause of education and religion as well found in him a stalwart champion. His home was always open for the reception of ministers and their families, and he did much to further the upbuilding of the Methodist Church in pioneer times. The circle of his friends grew as the circle of his acquaintance broadened. He achieved distinguished success in the several fields of effort which engaged his best thought, and his life was an exemplification of the loftiest patriotism and the truest conception of the American idea of the common brotherhood of man. Mr. Jordan, well endowed in mind and heart by nature and discipline, struggled for zeal for independence, and few in his day and his sphere have been so successful. His honesty and integrity closely adhered to the Golden Rule, which made for him a name highly honored throughout this section of the state. His sound judgment was always in demand. And it goes on, but I want to say that if there was any person that I ever, and I never thought I would write a book, but if I could write a book about somebody, I was honored to write a book about this man. And that is my talk. If you have any questions. So, questions? I don't know. We're supposed to be done at 2:30 and I'm 5 minutes over. So you decide.
There's a hand right
Okay,
there.
yes. Pardon me?
Where was it?
It was at Merrill Middle School. And it was,
at Merrill Middle.
yeah, and then they ended up tearing it down. That area of Des Moines, kind of between Valley Junction and Des Moines, the western part of Des Moines, that was kind of a no man's land. And actually his brother had settled his farm. The two brothers came together. James was out west, where his house is. But his brother, John, settled in called Heiner's Woods, which is south of there, just by the Walnut Creek. So, that was, and it was always considered sort of, a combination of the Valley Junction / Walnut Township / whatever, and Des Moines. Never really was one or the other, and for a long time. So it was easy for him to be able to have a place, have his church there. Or, yes.
And was Hannawalt Elementary School named after
Yes.
his husband?
It was named after the daughter's husband, George Hannawalt. But Emily,
My grandchildren call
of course. And Emily, and I mean, truly, there were no hospitals in Des Moines. George Hannawalt, Dr. George Hannawalt, came to Des Moines after the Civil War. He was their surgeon in the Civil War from Ohio. And the railroads hired him. The railroads would hire doctors. The railroads were everything. And he came with the railroads to settle in Des Moines and to care for the railroad workers here in Des Moines. And he ended up meeting, falling in love and marrying Emily Hannawalt, who was James Jordan's second born and his oldest daughter. And she never had children. And what happened was they ended up being the mother and father of the hospitals of Des Moines, or the metro area, started Tracy Home and Cottage Hospital. Tracy Home, actually, I believe it's that one, actually had a little award in Methodist Hospital for a long time. It was called that. Not anymore, and it was, as I said, the Hannawalts were Episcopalian, and St. Paul's Episcopalian Church was the funder for a lot of those initiatives, those early hospital initiatives. So, and that was in the 1860s, 70s, whatever. And there's a really fun story in there about how there was a big Ringling Brothers circus that came to town and it crashed into 4 Mile Creek, and how George Hannawalt coordinated the rescue efforts, and how Ringling did a special circus for him, and gave him all the proceeds from that circus to help with the hospitals. So, and also Ringling was a teetotaler, so that made everybody happy. Anyways, any other questions?
Did all
Yes.
11 of the children survive to adulthood?
No, there were some twins during the Civil War. One died going down the railing. Some of you might have gone out there for the ghost story. And she was only like 2 or 3 and supposedly fell, slid. And this is family, family stories. Slid down the railing, too young, was supposedly holding a cat. Got to the bottom, banged her head, died. And then her twin sister died of diphtheria when she was about 11. So those 2 didn't make it. There was one who, he was burned, I think his name was George, and he was burned when he was young and had a limp arm. And he ended up, and this is really too bad, this is a pathetic story, but I'll tell it because it's kind of a pathetic, fun story. He was older, and he those big trees out at the Jordan house, these big oak trees, and he was up sawing off a tree limb, but maybe sitting on the limb, I don't know, but he didn't have a good grip on it because he had one bad arm, and he ended up literally falling out of the tree and killing himself when the limb came down. So, yeah, I mean,
On their property.
right next to their house. Yeah, poor thing. I think he was a little, anyhow. So, anyways, whatever. You can only infer things from what you read. Anyways, what else? Any other questions? So now we get into the entertainment part of it, and I could go on, but you know what? You probably all need to go home. If you want to sit and listen to questions, you're welcome to. I don't want to, and I will be happy to, but I'll also be happy to sign any books you want, and also know that if you aren't interested in buying one tonight, you can get one, or today you can get one at Beaverdale Books, West Des Moines Historical Society, or at the Valley Junction Foundation office, which is the old fire hall. So, any other questions?
Can we purchase them tonight?
Yes, you can, and I'll sign them if you want me to. Yes, they're $30. Yes.
Louise, are you available to work with people on some of the questions that
Sure.
I know that
I am available. I have in the last 2 weeks. I think I gave 3 or 4 talks. I talk to any group who wants to hear what I have to say, and they're wide and varied groups. So if you have any group that you want to have me come present to, I'm happy to. Now that the story is written, but I will tell you, people say, are you going to do a sequel? And I say, absolutely not. This is my first and only book. And poor Jan, I think that she's been tortured enough. So anyways, no, but I'm happy to help you. I'll give you my number.
I had a second question.
And another question. Okay.
Are all of these wonderful documents available?
Those documents are in the book. So if you buy the book, you've got most of the stuff that's there. The eulogy may or may not be in there, but everything else, those maps are maps that I've collected over the decades. And there's more too, but we just brought those for today. So any other questions? Any other things about Valley Junction or Des Moines history or whatever? I'll give you one other little fun thing. 2 things. Slave state, free state. What was that? If Des Moines came into, Iowa came into the nation as a free state, it was the time when one had to be free and one had to be slave. What was the state that came in to counteract free state, slave state? What was the slave state that came in at the same time that Iowa? Not Missouri. No, Missouri is really an old state. That was settled. Florida. Another little trivial thing that you'll find interesting. Why is the Capitol on the east side of the Des Moines River? Why? Because the Republicans were in charge, okay? And the Democrats had a stronghold over on the west side of the river, and there was a big newspaper publisher there that leaned towards, that was a Democrat-focused newspaper. And so they were all Democrat on the west side of the river. And so James Grimes, Republican, he was kind of in charge. He was in charge at the time, and he said, "That's the east side of the river. That's the Republican side. We're going to have the Capitol there." Now, they didn't have any money to build the Capitol, but some probably Republican businessmen put up, I think, $20,000 to build a modest brick building that was our first Capitol over there. Yeah, so it's because it was totally along political lines. Yes.
So how far out did the Jordan farm go?
Okay, that's a good question. James Jordan bought a farm. He had 11 children, bought a farm for each of his children. In fact, and a lot of the land around his property right now, that little 40 acres is nothing. He owned all of the land, you know, Southwoods, this, that, the other thing. He owned what was Robin Hill Stables, which is kitty corner across the street. He owned land across Fuller Road in kind of the Bottoms area. He owned land, he bought farms for 2 boys that lived, ended up settling in DeSoto. One other child was up in Gilbert, Iowa. He bought farms for them. And what was really, this is kind of the demise, but also the brilliant idea of a patriarchal father. He also held all the deeds to the farms. And that was his insurance policy for his children. Oh, and he also gave Emily a house in Des Moines, Emily and George. But he said, and I think he trusted George. George was one of his executors. He trusted George, so I think they probably got the deed. But nobody else got the deed. And so when he died, you know, it was terrible because they had to go around and they had to, you know, do all this work with the deeds and everything because these kids could not sell their farms. They were not able to sell, and they couldn't. And that's exactly what he wanted. He wanted them to always have a lifetime ability to farm and feed themselves, and they weren't many of them were not happy about that. And you know, it was fractious to the family. And when I talk to the family now, they're still mad about it. Let me tell you, they're still ticked off. You know, I don't know, you know, about that other, you know, whatever. Go on.
Are there still alive his ancestors?
Or descendants? Yes.
That live around
Yes.
West Des
Well, when you see the book,
Iowa, I guess.
let me just show you. I'm going to give you an example of how many there are, because what we did is we wanted to make sure that they all had an opportunity to put input into the book and not. And so we made a list. These are the people that are descendants of James Jordan. Now, they're not. Some of them are no longer living, but one actually has been very generous to the West Des Moines Historical Society. So yes, there were many descendants, and I've of course been communicating with quite a few of them over the years. One in particular, and she has passed now. Well, actually 2, one here in Des Moines and one over by Chicago, who I would visit them. Oh, and I also visited one in Palm Desert, California. So, anybody else? Yes.
Cemetery.
Yes.
I assume he's buried there.
No, he is born. Yes, he is buried there. He is buried there. But his 2 daughters. He had 2 daughters that lived to adulthood. Emily Hannawalt and then Ella Jordan Cook. And so there was there were 2 different moms. Okay, the first mom, Melinda, her daughter was Emily. The second mom, Cynthia, her daughter was Ella. And my feeling is this, that Emily and Dr. Hannawalt were very successful. They had a lovely home and this and that, and they were doing all these wonderful things. Ella was out by, and literally lived kitty corner from her mom until the end. And she was a farmer's wife, and I think she kept looking into Des Moines and saying, something's not right here. I'm out here and she's in there, you know. Anyway, so that's my feeling. I'm just saying this. Strike me down if I'm wrong. But at any rate, so Emily and George have this big mausoleum in Woodland Cemetery. Walk through. It's on the east side of and you can kind of see it from MLK. And then guess what? Guess who else got buried there? Not long after Emily. Ella made sure she has a pretty good looking headstone. Not a mausoleum, but I mean, I think she wanted to be sure that she made the grade too in Woodland. But all the rest of them are out in Jordan. And that was also the site of a church that he tried to start not long after they first settled in Walnut Township. It did not make it, but he tried. And then that landed up going into becoming a cemetery. So, yes. What, you?
Okay. What was the approximate cost per acre for these farms that he was buying? I know
Oh.
it would be a ranger, but I just was wondering about.
No, when he first homesteaded in the very beginning, it was $1.25 an acre. And then of course it went up, but not, and there was so much land being bought and sold in Des Moines in the 1850s. And that's one of the reasons I didn't even get into. He helped start the State Bank of Iowa. There was no money here. They didn't have the currency that we have now. They had gold, and it was just a mess. And so, but just think about this. You know, we talk about 20,000 head of cattle. That's a lot of cattle. Well, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars a day in real estate transactions. And guess where they kept the money at that point in time? Iowa City. So they would take it. Somebody would go around at various times. It was never the same time because, you know, he might get. So he would go and collect all this gold, and then he would, you know, sneak it into Iowa City. Oh, it was terrible. So that's why they ended up starting the state bank. And one of the reasons why FM Hubble ended up buying Terrace Hill was because, and I always forget his name.
B.F. Allen.
Yeah, B.F. Allen, thank you. I always forget that. And his uncle, by the way, was in charge of Fort Des Moines when Fort Des Moines started. B.F. Allen actually built it, but B.F. Allen had money, and he was very successful, a very good man. But he got overextended because he had to back up all of his bills that he had printed with gold, and unfortunately, he got a little behind, and he ended up going, you know, really bankrupt, and he had to sell everything, and et cetera, et cetera. So, so enter FM Hubble. And then one thing I didn't say was that when FM Hubble did come to town after the Civil War, or around in that, you know, in that era, to start Equitable of Iowa, a life insurance company, which focused on a lot of appeal to the widows and families of people who had died during the Civil War, where there's no insurance. So he started this life insurance company in Des Moines and asked James Jordan to be on the first board of directors, along with Hoyt Sherman and some of the other people. I always say, wherever you see a street with an old name on it, that was a person that was on FM Hubble's board. He had all these really high, you know, high-profile people on his board to make it look plausible. So, and it was, obviously. It's still around, kind of. Yeah. Anyways, whatever. Anybody else? Okay, we're done. I will be up here signing books if you'd like to.
I'd like to thank everybody for coming today. We do not have an Iowa Files in December. What we do have is our holiday open house at the Jordan House in Bennett School on Sunday, December 1st from 1 to 4. This is pretty much the only time of the year that Bennett School is open. So please come if you have kids, grandkids, small children wandering the neighborhood. Bring them because we do some really fun crafts in the basement of Bennett. The Jordan House is decorated all up for the holidays. So it's gorgeous there. Our next Iowa Files is Sunday, January 19th, about Susan Clark and the end of a segregated school in Iowa. Iowa historian Leo Landis will be talking about this decision to really put Iowa at the forefront of the law. Thank you.
I came from the Society.